All right. So we're going to kick it off. Again, thanks everyone for joining. I am super excited to kick this off, to kick this series off. I've got Evan Oslick and I've got Brian Emsley. Thank you so much for joining, gentlemen. And to start this topic of building security review programs that actually scale, and a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, as you can all understand and know, I want to welcome Brian and Evan to give like a brief intro about themselves, the companies that they work at, and in like a sentence to dive right in, some of the challenges that they're facing and have faced when it comes to scaling their security review programs. And I'm just going to go randomly looking left to right because we always shift left, up unintended. And I'm going to start with Brian because he's left to me on the picture. So Brian,
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about yourself.
B2, Dimitri, thanks so much for having me. So my name is Brian Mazie. I lead product security and offensive security at Qualtrics. We are an experience management platform. So essentially surveys. So we facilitate, information gathering as well as surveys for large, enterprise and SaaS firms in various industries. I've been with the company for almost a year now, but have led previous security engineering and security operations previous roles at through previous industries. Really, the biggest challenge here is for scaling product security and security architecture throughout the engineering firm. Throughout our engineering team is really the biggest challenge is being able to accelerate. So getting in the hands to be self-service, the specific tools and methodologies that engineering teams can use in order to best service and be able to securely code and to essentially meet at their specific velocity, to be able to develop secure code at the speed that they're comfortable with, and really and also being able to rapidly deploy, rapidly prototype and interface the specific architectural requirements there in order for the engineering team to move fast. Really, I think the biggest thing is as we put quality gates in place, it could kind of be seen as an obstacle, as a stoppage for some folks who want to ensure that we have the appropriate guardrails in place for engineering teams, that they're able to move, as fast as they need to, but are able to do it in a secure manner, and the appropriate stoppages in place where it makes sense.
Fantastic. A lot of topics that you mentioned we're actually going to cover as we go and dive through the 5 core principles. Thanks, Brian, again. Thanks for being with us. And Evan, now as we're shifting right, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you again for having me. Brian, I'm looking forward to the conversation. My name is Evan Oslick. I am the product security manager over at Oscar Health. We are a health insurance company, mainly focused on the ACA exchange. A little bit of background. I started out as a software engineer, got into AppSec in the 2004 time. I've been through the .com to mobile to through social, through cloud, through now AI, and with it all, the scaling of AppSec has always had the same problem, keeping up with the change. Uh, Developers are always trying to do new things. Those frameworks don't always have security built in. And as we all know, the security team is just a little bit outsized by the engineering team. So just a little bit. So we're always looking at a factor of at least 10 to 20. I've been in companies where it was 400 to 1. I was on the wrong side of that 400. Um, so, for us, it's about making sure that we can not necessarily let developers run at their free reign speed, but at least be responsive enough to get information to them without being a office of no.
That's going to be also a very interesting point where how we're constantly being pushed back to the office of no, especially with all the transitions and transformations that are happening. Again, Evan, thanks for being here. So let's dive right in. So the scaling challenge, which is also what we're going to be like at the core of what we're talking about. And I think that there's a lot to be said of why security review programs hit a wall, especially in organizations that scale. By the way, I think the definition of scale changed and is changing in front of us with the introduction of AI, with the introduction of speed of execution. And there's kind of like 3 challenges, and I'm curious, and we'll pause here for just a minute because I'm curious if you would agree or if you add additional challenges here. And I think Brian, you've kind of alluded to that. But reviewing everything, we are, as security professionals, very much risk driven, and we are also paranoid to the sense of we don't know where that risk might creep in, because we've all been in situations where risk surprised us from areas that we didn't expect. So there is that need to be, okay, how can I take control of everything? The knowledge bottleneck, and Evan, you and I, as we were prepping, had some conversations around that, and I'm looking forward to bringing those conversations here around the expertise required from engineering functions when it comes to security and the nuances there. But there is a certain bottleneck. And I would say that that bottleneck is also produces a lack of consistency in reviews that, especially if they're done manually, because different security professionals, different school of thought, different understanding of what matters, and different approach to business needs oftentimes leads to inconsistency in security reviews, which is we're only human. And then measurement, which is very elusive. We have a whole core principle around KPIs and how we measure security review programs. But being able to track it, or just focusing on the particular thing of like, oh, how many we've just completed versus kind of like a bit of a backstory, doesn't really speak to the importance and how we do when it comes to scaling. And I think that kind of like bottom line, like one sentence to take from this that as I was preparing, is very similar to what you said about 400 to 1, is security teams grow linearly while engineering requests grow exponentially. And so I'm curious, and I'll start with Evan. Do you think there are additional challenges, or these pretty much kind of sum them up?
I think that the knowledge bottleneck takes two forms. There's not just the security aspect, but with the ever-changing technology stack that the engineering teams are supposed to know, there's even a knowledge bottleneck on the security side, in that we're expected to be able to keep up with all the tech stacks as well. So you've got this kind of uh, dual dual-headed sword type function there. But yeah, I think that those are the three biggest challenges that you're going to have.
Brian, any thoughts on this? Or are we kind of covering it all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you are covering it all. And especially I'm very curious. I know as we dive into the review everything piece, it really is about, understanding how best to prioritize, right? Building a process in which setting by standards or policy, what do we, are we, because we have limited resources, and as you mentioned, security teams are only growing linearly if they're growing at all. How best to be able to commandeer those resources and be able to attack them to what really matters most. Do you have visibility to what is actually crucial for that security expertise?
Yeah, I think statement of do more with less comes often to mind when it comes to security teams, and everyone gets their own AI co-pilot comes to mind when you think about development. But okay, so we understand the problem, so let's dive right in. We don't really want to be in a state of just admiring the problem. Let's talk a little bit about the principles. So let's open this up. So the one is, which really speaks volumes to me, and it's oftentimes very easy to overlook, and that is the business impact driven intake. And I think a lot of the companies that I speak to, and companies that I've been part of, there is a certain process of an intake, and it varies from very very robust bunch of questions to like something more on the lower side. But what's interesting to me is that that intake process, is very much driven and built through the eyes of a security professional. And there is a certain expectation of similar understanding from development. And I want to challenge that for a second. And so the five things that I think are very, very crucial in asking, and so essentially in the core principle, how can we create this intake with limited amount of questions, but with maximum understanding for the security teams, and whether if it's focusing on data sensitivity or exposure surface, or is there any the magnitude of that change? Is there any regulatory footprint that is involved? And I think to me, the one thing that to take from this personally would be the blast radius. And that is, what is the worst realistic business outcome if this thing goes really, really bad? And I think that creates this thought process that goes into the minds of developers and engineering and anyone who is not strictly within security, that at least has to pause and think about this. And so, Brian, I'm gonna start with you with this particular principle. One, your thoughts, and two, how do you look at this at Qualtrics as you look at the intake and how you're dealing with especially changes in new features?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. And I love how you modeled this out because it is explicitly dealing with some of the, some of the very, high level topics that we do need to address as early as we can in order to best prioritize some of these requests. So typically in the past, what we've seen at Qualtrics is, and I'm sure many of us, we've struggled with this, is, when interfacing with engineering teams, is how best to appropriately prioritize the work. And so really this first principle is addressing two main things, right? Is does the security engineering team, does your team have the appropriate visibility and are targeting the things that actually need your, need your expertise, your knowledge? As Evan had mentioned, there's a scarcity and really the not knowledge bottleneck, right? And so you need to ensure that do we have for those limited resources that we have, we're targeting the appropriate things. But then also you want to build a standard or some sort of self-service intake requirement or form that does not require a security expertise from the submitter, right? We don't want and don't expect our software devs to be able to be security experts. And so we want to make it as easy as possible to get the information that we need in order to do the proper prioritization. And so we want to move away from this state, this pattern of first in, first out, or the noisiest team gets first priority. Want to ensure that we're actually doing a risk-based assessment on that. And so what we did at Qualtrics is we qualified a security design engagement according to a risk profile. And so we used an auto prioritization method in which, we reduced both the burden on the security team as well as on the eng teams. And so actually utilizing a lot of these dimensions that Dimitri had kind of pointed out here, we looked at building a very, very straightforward self-service form that's presented to the engineering teams in which we ask some basic questions about their service or feature. What is the sensitivity of data? Is it processing, sensitive data? Exposure service, right? Who can reach it? Is it externally available? And then based on some of those responses, the risk score could potentially be higher. Also looking at the change magnitude, are you modifying, something that's going to be critical? An authentication authorization logic? Does it have to adhere to regulatory compliance requirements? And also, the really big thing that Dimitri mentioned, the blast radius. If this were potentially to be breached or have an incident related to it, would this cause a service disruption to an internal team? Or could this be catastrophic to the business? So there's going to be several things there. Based on that logic, we assign a numerical score according to, and also weights for each of these. Depending on the industry and depending on the company, these may potentially have different weighting schedules, right? And according to these dimensions, you kind of hit it on a review tier. And so then, based on how that service, how that service plays out, and your team will only be focusing on criticals and highs, and then establish a process in which you could have, at some sort of low magnitude, or for low magnitude changes, some sort of self-service or auto approval for for very, very low magnitude changes. And so these are some of the things that we implemented, and I found that we were reviewing. There were UX changes, etc. These are things that never should have been in the queue for my team. And so by limiting that, we've kind of eliminated a lot of the noise and being able to focus our expertise and really the put our primary focus in on critical and high risk changes.
Amazing. Thank you, Brian. Evan, real quick to you, because there's one aspect here which I'm really curious. And this is like the second to last, the regulatory footprint, right? And especially, I've got to put it as in plain language and not acronym soup, because oftentimes what to us, who's been in security, SOX, PCI, HIPAA, high trust, that's kind of like a second language. Developers engineering don't necessarily understand the impact of a change that might have and might put a company in the crosshairs. Is there anything in terms of when it comes to Oscar being a health tech company, is there anything that there where it makes it easier, more challenging as you go through the intake process, or what would be your 2 cents here?
So it's interesting because the regulatory stuff really adds a lever that we can push for moving things forward. Um, I've been in industries where there is none, and when you have no compliance, it becomes a lot harder to push some security through. So compliance actually ends up being a good first gear for getting developers to think about security. And especially when we look at like the blast radius these days, you've got data feeding every single system. It's not just, oh, am I internet facing? Because yeah, you may have an app that's internet facing, but that app could feed into some internal app, the data, which is susceptible to some vulnerability, and that data could be consumed by the external app, and the external app could be doing what it needs to do to protect it, but the consuming app isn't. And we're seeing a lot of that now, actually, not at Oscar specifically, but in the industry with, you know, prompt injection. You've got agents out there that are just consuming vast amounts of data and really not analyzing what's coming in, and the prompts are getting overwritten and you're getting exploited on internal apps, not the external ones.
Amazing. So let's take a look with that into principle number two. And I really like, Brian, you kind of prepared us for this as you were talking about. I am. We were processing. We're looking at um, different UI UX changes, which really shouldn't be a case. So Evan, I'm going to actually dive into this principle with you, and that is when to require design review. And we were talking about the intake process, but now that we're kind of like on the aspect of analyzing that intake and understanding, so when do we require review if there's any changes in trust boundaries, or obviously auth auth z logic changes, sensitive data flows, and so on and so forth. Any particular approach when it comes to how you're looking at this that makes the decision fast, consistent, and defensible? And here it's more around to reduce the friction and the back and forth that oftentimes happens when, hey, this needs to be a go through a security review. Well, why does it need to go through a security review? I only, marked only that there's, PCI data or PII or PHI. So, and it's only a minor change. It's only an API change. So how are you dealing with this?
So we kind of take an approach of, is there new technology being implemented? If there is, we definitely want to take a look at it. As Brian said, if you're just doing a UI change, we don't really want to look at it. We are also looking at anything that deals with authentication and authorization changes, especially if you're adding on a functionality or leveraging a new type. So say you're going from implementing Magic Link for the first time. Even if we're using a standard framework, we will want to take a look at it to make sure it's being implemented in a secure way. Those are typically what we look at. We do have another process where we will look at our findings from our automated tools. And if those findings are starting to come back with things, we'll look at architecture just in reviewing those results and kind of see what's going on there. But yeah, it's definitely, again, you've got the speed and the, with now agentic coding, we're not looking at exponential increases. You're looking at probably factors of 10, each person getting 10 agents and running them simultaneously. What we're looking at going forward is going to be even more challenging.
I think it's also, I completely agree. The ability to put those even, I guess, questions, or not questions, but checks and balances earlier in the process is going to be very, very interesting and critical as we move forward. Brian, anything to add when it comes to what to require? And I would even throw a bit of a little question here. When do you request on demand a security review versus somebody submitted, you went through it, and they're like, "Oh, we don't really need a review," and you're like, "No, we actually really do." If you can give like a bit of an example of kind of like how it goes outside of band.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, typically, yeah, there are going to be scenarios in which, as mentioned, they're going to be there will be unplanned engagements, right? In which case, right, you will always have the best scenario for as it's going through this approved workflow and pipeline. But yes, for the unplanned engagements, certainly we want to take a look at certainly there's going to be things during the engagement with the engineering team, kind of looking at the magnitude of change. For example, one specific piece is, I think just honestly by default, if somebody is spinning up a new MCP server, automatically that is going to go in, that will go into our queue. We want to take a look at its appropriate implementation, take a look, take a look at its review, etc. And also, if for example a change to potentially an integration with the use of a third party package or the use of an open source library, and its integration has changed, or if we're making changes to API, that will automatically to our API service, that will automatically trigger our review on our end. And so, usually how we've done that is there's going to be detective ways there. There's going to be some automated tooling in which you're doing, in which you're potentially looking at these potential changes, but also as part of your, as part of your scanning engagements, as part of your pen test engagements, with as you're doing internal pen testing to review, take a look and see if there's been any significant shift or changes in how a service operates, or frankly, if a new feature is out there that your team hasn't had visibility on, certainly that would be something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. The crown jewels that if they're being addressed or if they're being changed, that will obviously be a substantial trigger. But one thing to those who are with us during this webinar, one thing that I would say is that making the decision defensible, which I think is kind of like a summarization from what both Evan is saying and Brian, is key, because I want to connect this back to what Evan said of being the office of no. I think that makes it that helps tremendously in my experience as well, to have a conversation where it's not, we've decided that there's a need for a security review and here's just what we need from you, but rather here's the why. It's not just we're asking you for additional work. Here's the why from a security, from a risk, from a business risk perspective. And so being consistent and defensible, I think is very much key. Before we jump into the third one, real quick, again, a plug for those who joined us in terms of housekeeping. We will have a Q&A session towards the end, so please feel free to drop in any questions you might have for us, especially for my esteemed guests. I always want to use the term esteemed guest, so thank you, Brian and Evan, for letting me do that. So for my esteemed guests, drop that into the chat and we'll plug that in. As well as we have a non-vendor related, we have a closed Slack group that we're expanding for professionals within the product security and security architecture. If you're interested in joining, drop me a note. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the third principle, which is what really should never require a human review, which is different from not requiring a review at all, which will also be, it's a little hook into the fourth principle, which is around automation, which we'll get there in a couple of minutes. But Brian, in terms of things that doesn't require a review, it should never human be in the loop. There's a few options here. There's a few things here, right? For example, internal only tools, which I've put here, and I have a little bit of I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with this statement. But other things like architecture patterns and so on and so forth, is there anything here that you would say, I want to add to this? Like you already mentioned the UI UX changes, but is there any additional categories? And then what I am interested in is what should be the monitoring piece of it, so that it's internal right now, but in about 3 weeks time, that API, which is only internal, now has exposed because there's a new business logic and security is just not aware of it.
Yeah, great call. I really appreciate that. So several things there. I think this principle really builds on what we had talked in the first two principles, right? And I really appreciate the distinction, Dimitri, that you mentioned. Yeah, we're differentiating never the need for human review, but there is still a review happening, right? The automated review, which obviously we'll speak more about later on. But nonetheless, certainly I think I want to briefly cover several topics here, which what I found is to be of value that Qualtrics has implemented on our end. So really, I think the two biggest things in which we found what was of greatest value is we've implemented a process in which we have been able to accelerate the return of highly valuable results back to the submitter, back to the engineer, and also being able to put the time for our security engineers and security architects to go after the highly complex, larger problems, so to speak, or the reviews that do require human intervention. So really in this case, I do want to focus on number one, the pre-approved architecture patterns. So what we've found, for a lot of us who are in mid-level to enterprise level firms, you typically will have what would be, and frankly, even smaller organizations, you typically have what would be considered widely accepted reference architecture, right? And so this is a specific, there's a specific way in which we built identity services. There's a specific way in which, we do auth and auth, et cetera. How we do account segregation, et cetera. So these would be what we'd consider, golden patterns, or, in this case, pre-approved architecture patterns. And so really, in order to, to best accelerate and, to not need, for the need for human review, is to kind of consolidate some of those reviews. So typically, if you have a standard deploy, that's utilizing this reference architecture, the inter organizations maintaining a library of reviewed and approved architecture patterns, and any deployment going forward conforms to these approved architecture patterns, then typically what we found was this is going to be safe to be, what I say, auto reviewed, auto approved, right? So no need for human review. Dimitri, you did mention the point of the detection monitoring. You have to implement some sort of feedback loop. There has to be a monitoring capability there. And what I would suggest is ensure that there is human oversight, right? So as you mentioned, in terms of if there is a change in functionality or change in scope for a specific API endpoint, ensure that how are we monitoring that? So is there an automated solution, or is there some sort of, if there's a detective measure that we have that is monitoring that configuration drift, to ensure that, hey, because initially this was auto approved due to the fact that it hit along these lines, right? Configuration change within approved bounds, within approved constraints, patch level dependency bumps, etc. But if something does go above that specific threshold, there has to be a detective control in place. And so certainly what we found is, yes, have that in place, auto review, auto approval, but ensure that we implement a feedback loop. I typically like to have some sort of weekly cadence in which we are taking a look. You're doing a sample of these reviews. Or frankly, initially what we did was we started with all of these reviews just to take a look to ensure that is it in alignment with what we have, with what we've implemented and what we expect for it to perform. That has been going very well. And so now we've just taken a sampling. But yes, on a weekly cadence or even bi-monthly cadence, to have a monitoring, some sort of monitoring cadence, utilize automated tooling in order to take a look at ensuring that it's still operating within those means, in order to make sure that you have that feedback loop, that you make sure that it continues to be aligned and tuned according to what you're putting out there.
And with that, which is a great hook, I'm jumping into the like a very essence, right? Because you've mentioned automation a couple of times in your sentences, Brian. And as you can see, the slide is very different from the others, because this is more on, I really want those who joined us to hear from you and from your experiences and from your implementations and what's working, what's not. So Evan, I'm gonna kick it off to you. Automation it's been thrown out so many times. You've mentioned all the different, the .com and the mobile, and everywhere there was promises of automation. This automation, that. Now we're in the age of AI. Staying true to the promise to those who joined in of like no BS, concrete things. To me, a little bit about automation, concrete automation that works at Oscar Health around scaling security reviews.
So one of the biggest things that has worked for us is we have tied in a review at an architecture level into our linear ticketing system, as well as into our documentation systems from a threat model perspective, and leveraging that. That gives us some insight. Of course, that relies on accuracy and completeness of the requirements being specified. We are looking into how we can leverage integrations into things like Claude Code and the planning documents, and leveraging MCPs with the toolings as well. One of the bigger things that we've done, which really isn't an automation per se, but it ends up being one, is we've actually done monthly meetups and have gotten decent turnout from the engineering team on those. And that's actually built the relationships up, which allows us to have the conversations and have kind of security reviews in an ad hoc way, and work with teams on understanding what their development life cycle is, and what they want to see. So as we start seeing things like, OpenClaw getting put out there and some AI agentic sandboxing getting done, how are we going to interface with that? What are we going to see? As Brian mentioned in the previous topic, are we using the secure reference architectures that we want to use that will help speed up and get automation out there even faster? The more things change, the more they stay the same.
You mean the more security stays small and without the amount of headcount that it requires?
Yeah, but if you, like I said, when we've partnered with the engineering team, we're able to get those reference architectures out there in
Mhm.
a way that is a lot cleaner and a lot more collaborative than throwing it over the wall and being the silo. I've always found throughout the career that I've had that when you partner with the engineering team, you don't have to be as forceful with it. And then you can leverage your automation tools that you have in place. For instance, we have scanning on PR submit before merge. So we were able to notify the team, hey, we're going to start blocking this type of vulnerability. But let's have a conversation about it. And we had a back and forth on it, and we're able to update the rules so that we weren't as intrusive and provided guidance on how they can remediate the issues. And because of that relationship building that we did, it wound up serving us well.
Fantastic. I love the little plug of the monthly meetups, which is it is in a way of an automation, or at least it promotes once automation is in place, given that relationship building. Um, Brian, what about you? What about Qualtrics and automation?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part, I'll kind of mention two key processes that we've implemented automation during the design review. So very similar to what Evan had mentioned in terms of the implementation of this process. As mentioned, we have there's a specified line path in which we're grabbing an intake from engineering or product managers, right? That specific request or task is going to be funneled into the team. And so as part of that is, during the during that intake process, we're doing the risk assessment, looking at the impact score, et cetera. And part of that too, in any request that comes in, we are doing an automated threat modeling risk assessment that's done right there. And the input is written directly into our ticketing system. We use Jira, and so it's written directly there. So it is, as you mentioned, defensible. There is a point in which we can reference back to these are the specific concerns and recommended controls that we would like you to implement based on the context of that. And so then what, not only does that accelerate our analysis of that given, that specific service or feature, but also what that does is it gives visibility to the engineering team for them to be able to see. These are some of the key things that the team is looking at. We've also kind of modeled something very similar on our risk exception process. And so, typically that's owned by the compliance team. What we've done is we've partnered directly with them along with security architecture. And we've put an automated process as part of our risk intake form. And so when we've taken this a risk assessment form, have the engineering team fill that out. But what we've done is we want to simplify that. As mentioned, we do not require engineers to be security experts. What we'd like them to do is have visibility to some of our security concerns. So we've taken this input, standardized it, and fed this into our automation engine, which Dimitri, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Fed this into our automation engine, and then it kind of does the same. It does the same thing, and does it quicker and better. It is essentially our automated security architect, right? And what we've done is have accelerated the evaluation of exceptions. Is this going to be something that we can tolerate, that we can accept, or does this require more work for the engineering team to be aware of?
Fantastic. And one thing that I'm going to pick from Brian, from what you said, which I think is a very good tidbit, and that is we're very focused, and I've sparked a thought process here. We've been talking about engineering and talking to engineering and developers, and you mentioned a different source of intake, that's product managers. And I think that the ability to plug into that through automation could actually initiate the review at a much earlier point. And something for everyone who's listening to consider, if we could now inject security requirements into the PRD stage before it kind of flows and being unpacked by engineering into how, what are the tasks. That's potentially a very, not saying it works for everybody, but just as a thought process, that's a very sweet spot before we now have actual engineering tasks already kind of like, running through the process. So that might be a very, very good additional little item. Being mindful of time, and I do want to spend some time on Q&A. And a big shout out to Cameron for breaking the ice and sending us a question, which we'll get to in a minute. The last principle, which is KPIs and how we actually measure scale. I think one thing when I was working on this one and we were chatting about that came to mind is, and I think it also kind of incorporates all the other principles that we spoke about, whether if it's auto approval rate and how many we were able to do across period of time, satisfaction from engineering on speed of responses and accuracy, and then feeding back, if we have a reduced amount of pushbacks, but feeding that back to the approved patterns, which we also mentioned, is so we're kind of creating feedback loops from KPIs that we're measuring. I think there is quite a lot of KPIs that we can dive in and unpack, which help to establish a much more robust measurement of how we're doing as we scale. And of course, this is not just to us of looking at how we're doing, but it's also for us to showcase upstream to management and to senior management, all the way to the point where, throwing this out there for consideration, metrics that the CISO during board meetings can showcase and say, here's how security is tackling issues early in the development process, early in the business requirements, and how the business evolves, and oftentimes does that with AI. And yes, AI is not a bad word. And although we tried hard and long not to use that during the webinar, but here it is. But that is a critical part of automation these days, and we shouldn't look past it. And so to me, I think this is kind of like a great, fifth principle of how do we not only implement different aspects and improve the entire process end to end, but we need to be true and honest in also how we actually measure it. So if we're kind of looking at it and summarizing it for a second before we jump into the Q&A, quick wins and what you can do very much from tomorrow. So some of the topics that we spoke about. One, the blast radius. I think just even if you start thinking through, are we answering this question in the existing process or in the process we're about to build? Yes or no? What does it mean? I think it's a huge win right away. It's not a massive change, but it's a perception change which can substantially help. The auto approve process, I think there at that time, to Brian's point, I think thinking about the feedback loops and the measurement of if it's auto approved, how do we verify that there's no drift is something that's really, really critical to incorporate into our thought process as we build those out. Over a month, you can actually start incorporating some of the KPIs that we showed of how much stuff was auto approved, how much stuff we were engaged directly, how much satisfied our customers are within that engagement. And then I think last but definitely not least, and maybe it's not a quarter, I think again with how things are moving at the speed of how things are moving, automating and pre-approving and building those patterns, which is driven by you already provided security controls or your guidance, which you've already done, being able to go query those and based on those build certain patterns and incorporate them, I think could be a very substantial win and reduction in pressure coming to security teams. With that, I'm very happy to spend the next 15 minutes in more of an open Q&A. And just let's keep this slide for a second and kind of jump into the first question. So Cameron, again, thanks a lot for putting this out there. So I'm going to read it to Evan and Brian. And Evan, I'm already prepping you mentally. You're going to be the first one to jump in for a response. So in your experience when building an AppSec program, Have you noticed or identified some core activities, initiatives that would be ideally part of any well-designed AppSec program? In other words, if you were building an AppSec program from the ground up, have you noticed certain initiatives, efforts that should generally be included in any AppSec program?
Dimitri, that is actually a very good question. And for better or worse, I've had the opportunity to start a few of them. And all of them start with the same practice of going out and meeting people. Security doesn't happen without building out relationships. And it can't be the relationship built out on a, hey, I need you to fix this tomorrow. That typically doesn't look very favorably on. So I've typically gone and held meetings with all of the engineering team's leaderships to get to know them and to see what their struggles are and to see how their development lifecycle works. I'd rather try to find a way to fit into their program than have them make major changes to be in ours. From a actual secure SDLC perspective, there are several who will say that looking at DAS to get an idea of what is actually, quote, exposed and a vulnerable path that is known is the way to go. I typically go for the other side, which is I want to look at the source code, and I typically run SAST. I know the arguments against it are they're noisy, they're false positives. I use it as an opportunity to get a feel for the architecture. I'm not looking at the vulnerabilities. I see AppSec as a engineering problem, not a vulnerability problem. So if I'm tracking vulnerabilities, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I want to be seeing what paved roads can I put out there, what reference architectures can we put out there, and how can I help the engineering team improve their process so that they get better throughput in a safe way.
Very interesting. Let me challenge you, or let me make this a little bit more challenging for you. If you knew this was coming, come on, you know me by now. If you were to introduce one automation by default, what would that be that you haven't done in the past, and it was more difficult to do this? As we always say, we're oftentimes bolt on security after the fact.
We are definitely bolt on after the fact. There is no question about it. I'm still going for my SaaS tool. It's how can I integrate that into the CI/CD pipeline or whatever the development process is? It gives me the opportunity to understand where the gaps are, again, from a review of it from an architecture perspective. After that, I will probably lean toward doing an automated architecture review, just because by that point, I have an understanding of how long it's going to take to shift that architecture and what happens if there is a feature that winds up extending a poorly designed architecture.
Yeah, I wonder if there was only a tool that does, AI-based security architecture reviews. I mean, really, I don't know. Brian, thanks, Evan. Brian, so I'll repeat the question. In other words, if you were building an AppSec program from the ground up, have you noticed certain initiatives, efforts that should generally be included in any AppSec program?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think Evan, I totally agree with Evan's response there. I completely respect that. My view there is it boils down to, again, as Evan mentioned, relationships. It boils down to me is it starts with people, processes, and then tools. Really, it is in that order. And so, really the biggest thing is building relationship, a working relationship between security engineering, with the people. And so there's some core things that we can do. One of the, highly industry standard, industry tested method that we do is security champions. So spinning up a security champions program. I think there are some, very much industry wide ways in which that is deployed. But I think for every organization, it can be different. Us, it's, we go fairly technical on the engineering side. Want to ensure that they are as self-service as they can, just given how small my team is, and given the ratio of security engineers to engineers. So it really starts with the people, building that rapport, knowing that they have access to the specific tools or processes that they need, and then now building the processes. Security needs to take time in which they build a well thought out in-depth program as to how is AppSec going to operate. We mentioned reference architecture. Ensure that the engineering team, they have access to what is best practice, making sure that it aligns to a specific secure coding methodology. OWASP top 10, etc. OWASP API top 10, all that stuff, and then going into tooling, right? because when you're aligned with the people, with the engineering aspect, you're aligned with processes, then you can find strategically, you can find the correct tools that can then augment some of those processes. And we talk about shifting left, right? And so you want to implement a lot of these processes and tooling during the design phase, sometimes even during the ideation phase, because you're working alongside engineering and product management. But really, I think just high level, it really boils down to the people, the processes, and then the tools, all working together there.
Fantastic. Another one and this time from Samir. Samir, thanks a lot. Is there a common list of security patterns that you suggest? Evan, we'll come back to you on this one.
So, I think the first pattern that I would look at is what you're already doing for authentication and authorization. If you don't have that, then you effectively are blind to anything that's going on. That's the first one. The next one I would probably look at is logging. Again, make sure the developers are aware, log events, not data. Typically, if you're logging data, you're going to wind up with a data leak somewhere that you don't need or want, and that's going to be a risk. But those are probably the top two that I would look at from a security pattern perspective. Then when you start looking at where are you deploying your product to, how is it getting deployed, what kind of automations can we put in that deployment pipeline, and those types of things. Brian, have you seen anything else that you would like to add on that one?
Yeah, no, Evan, I appreciate it. Wholeheartedly agree with you there, especially on the deployment piece. How are we treating specifically commonly accepted patterns there? API edge patterns. Are there ways in which how are we deploying that? Deploying services to the edge? Is there appropriate? Is there standard security controls in place in which we are protecting those endpoints? And also, I think this is probably more applicable to functionality, functions or services that are potentially inherited, in which you're modernizing it or transforming something, utilizing microservices architecture. There's going to be migration. So if you need to break down a big monolithic code base into microservices, typically then that kind of pattern there, the migration offloading pattern, how is that pursued? Updating the routing layer, how each endpoint speaks to one another. That's going to be that's kind of my thoughts there.
So again, thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Samir. I know we have a few minutes. My one question to you as we kind of part ways, and I'll start actually with Brian. One core principle that drives you as a security professional that you would like to leave with everyone who joined us, what would that be?
Well, that's a great question. One core principle that drives me as a security professional.
That's one last little curveball I got for you.
I like that. Honestly, that's a fantastic question. I think really this boils down to, honestly, security is with really it portends to dealing with people. It is and frankly, I think hopefully, Evan, you and I think are kind of aligned on that. I think the biggest thing that really drives me is the relationships, building it with folks. So both on, independent of where the person sits in the organization, there's going to be an inherent interest and responsibility for that person, in terms of security, whether it be on the physical security end, but specifically on the ProdSec, AppSec side, SecOps side, there will be an interest and it will have a role to play with security. So I think the really biggest thing that drives me is what is that responsibility to the person as it comes to security processes, and also how do we ensure that they are able to do their job efficiently and effectively, with it continuing to be secure, without having security be a function that's added on top of their responsibility. How are they able to do it securely as seamlessly as part of their job function? I think that's the biggest driver for me.
Evan, same to you.
Well, first, I want to thank you again, Dimitri, for giving me the opportunity to be here. Brian, it's been great having the conversation. My principle is kind of two-phased. I play volleyball, and one of the first coaches I had his phrase was better the ball. And it's just, you don't look at where things are, you look at where they're going, and it's always focusing on improving the situation. And I'm a software engineer at heart. It's what I do. It's who I am. and improving the engineering process and the quality of the product for the customer who's using it. Ultimately, they are the ones that we are responsible for and hosting their data and making sure they're able to do their work. And that includes also the engineers doing the building. They are our customers. So it's making sure that they are able to get what they need to get. And we're all geared toward the same goal.
Fantastic. I just want to do a quick call out. Rishi, I saw your question, and what we're going to do is I'm going to take that question offline. I'm going to ask Evan and Brian. I'm going to personally follow up with an email. Evan, Brian, and everybody who joined, thanks a lot for a great kickoff to our webinar series. Stay on the lookout. There's a few more coming. Awesome conversation. Always a pleasure to be with you in the same virtual room. And also who joined, thanks a lot for spending your time with us. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, Dimitri.
Have a good one.
Bye, guys. Thanks, Evan.